You'd had the rate lock page pulled up on your phone every single morning that week, sitting at 7.12. You hit refresh and the number flipped red, 7.25. Nothing obvious caused it. The Fed hadn't raised rates, inflation hadn't jumped, the jobs report was forgettable. Yet that small red number just tacked roughly $130 onto your monthly payment for the next 30 years. So what actually moved it? The answer is a man in Tokyo you'll never meet, making one small, perfectly sensible decision at his desk, a decision that traveled across an entire ocean to quietly reach into your wallet. This isn't really a story about a number getting too large. It's a story about who's still willing to hold that number, and what happens the moment they stop. I'm Nick, and today we're getting into the early stages of a US debt unraveling that's already underway. It just doesn't look like an unraveling. It looks like an ordinary Tuesday. Let me walk you through why. Here's what most people get wrong about the national debt. They fixate on how enormous it is, and honestly, the size is absurd. As I record this, the US government owes something in the neighborhood of $39 trillion. That figure is so massive it stops registering as real, so let's break it down. The interest alone, just the cost of renting money it already borrowed, now runs past $1 trillion annually. That comes out to roughly $32,000 every second. In the time it took to read that sentence, the government borrowed more than most people earn in a year, purely to cover interest on debt taken out long ago. And that interest bill just quietly crossed a line it was never supposed to cross. The United States now spends more each year servicing debt than it spends on the entire military combined. Sit with that for a moment. The most expensive fighting force in human history is now the cheaper budget line. We're paying more for yesterday's decisions than we're paying to defend tomorrow. But here's the piece that actually matters. The size of the debt itself isn't the dangerous part. A big number just sits there quietly. What's actually dangerous is the mechanism underneath it and the way that mechanism feeds on itself. When the government can't cover its spending, it borrows, and that borrowing generates interest, and the interest gets tacked onto the spending gap it already couldn't cover. So next year it has to borrow even more at rates climbing higher as old cheap debt matures and rolls into new, pricier debt. It's the exact same position as someone paying off one credit card's minimum with a second credit card. You already know how that story ends. You've just never watched an entire country live it out in real time. And this isn't some fringe internet theory. The people running Wall Street's largest banks and hedge funds have started saying it out loud in that careful, lawyered tone wealthy people use when they're genuinely nervous. One has called the debt the single biggest threat the country faces. Another keeps warning that America is approaching a point where the math simply stops adding up. When the people who profit most from the current system start narrating its cracks out loud, it's usually time to look up from your phone. Spread that trillion-dollar interest bill across every household in the country, and it works out to roughly $7,000 to $8,000 a year per family, just to cover interest. You never see a bill for it, you just pay it in 100 untraceable little ways. For years, none of this really mattered, and there's a specific reason why. Someone was always there buying, which brings us to the man in Tokyo. Let's call him Kenji. Kenji manages money for a large Japanese institution, and for nearly his entire career, his job was boring in the best possible sense. Money came in, and a large chunk of it went straight into United States treasuries, American government debt, the safest asset on the planet. He didn't do this out of any affection for America. He did it because Japan had held its own interest rates near zero for a generation, meaning there was essentially nothing to earn at home. So the obvious move was sending the money across the Pacific, or at least the debt paid something. Kenji, along with thousands of people just like him, quietly became a kind of invisible foundation underneath the entire US Treasury market, so dependable that America stopped noticing they were even there. You don't thank the floor for holding you up, you just assume it always will. Then, in 2025, that floor shifted. Japan's central bank finally ended its decades-long experiment with free money and started raising rates. By year's end, Japanese interest rates sat at their highest point in 30 years. That increase sounds small. We're talking fractions of a percent. But for Kenji, it changed the entire calculation because he could suddenly earn a safe return in his own currency at home without the hassle of converting yen into dollars and back again. The whole reason to send money overseas began evaporating, and for the first time in his career, Kenji had an actual reason to bring the money home. Not panic, not a fire sale, just, buy a little less next time. Let some of those American bonds mature and quietly not replace them. Multiply that one calm, rational decision across an entire generation's worth of capital, and you've got a real problem. Because at the exact moment America needed to sell more debt than it ever had in its history, one of its most loyal buyers started politely backing away from the table. And here's the twist barely anyone talks about. It's not simply that foreign buyers are going quiet, it's who stepped in to replace them. Just a couple years ago, the largest overseas holders of American debt were foreign governments and central banks. Patient, unglamorous institutions like Kenji's. Buyers who ride out a bad quarter because they're playing a decades-long game. That's changed. Foreign private investors, hedge funds, asset managers, leveraged traders have quietly overtaken governments as the largest foreign holders of U.S. debt. And those players are not patient. Their entire job is to move the second condition shift. So the market didn't just lose a buyer, it traded its calmest, steadiest shock absorber for a hair trigger. The floor didn't vanish. It got nervous, and nervous money behaves in a very particular way. Patient money, Kenji's kind, rides out a scary headline because it's playing a 30-year game. Nervous money reads that same headline and hits sell before lunch. So the real danger was never some dramatic afternoon of foreign investors dumping American debt all at once. It's subtler than that. It's that the buyers who remain will demand a bit more interest to take on the risk and bolt a bit faster the second things start wobbling. You don't need an outright crash to break a market. You just need everyone in it standing a little closer to the exit. So now you've got the full setup. The debt keeps compounding, the loyal money keeps drifting home, and whatever money remains is jumpy. Which finally brings us back to the question from the beginning. Why did your mortgage rate move during a week when literally nothing happened? Here's the chain, and it's shorter than you'd expect. When holders like Kenji buy fewer treasuries or sell off what they already hold, the price of those bonds drops. And when a bond's price drops, its yield, the interest it pays out, rises. That's just basic seesaw mechanics. Now, American mortgage rates aren't set directly by the Federal Reserve. They're built on top of the 10-year Treasury yield. Banks take that yield and stack their own margin on top, and that stack becomes your mortgage rate. So when yields climb, your rate climbs right along with them, on some random Tuesday, for a reason you'd never spot from your kitchen table. Economists at one regional Federal Reserve bank actually quantified this. A single heavy month of foreign selling could push U.S. yields up by more than half a percentage point. Apply that to an average American home loan, and you're looking at roughly an extra $130 a month every single month for 30 years paid by a family that has never heard Kenji's name and never will. And the pressure isn't only arriving from overseas, it's also building right down the block. Meet the second person in this story. Let's call her Rosa. Rosa's a loan officer at a regional bank in a mid-sized American town. Not a Wall Street giant, but the kind of bank where small businesses get their credit lines and first-time buyers get their mortgages. Rosa's sitting on a slow-motion problem because her bank, like plenty of regional banks, is holding a hefty stack of commercial real estate loans, office buildings, strip malls, hotels. And here's the ugly little secret about commercial property debt. Unlike your home loan, those loans don't pay themselves down gradually. They come due all at once, one giant balloon payment, and then they need refinancing. Well over $1 trillion of that debt has come due recently, with hundreds of billions more stacked right behind it. All of it borrowed years ago, back when rates sat near zero and those buildings were worth a fortune. Now those loans are landing in a completely different world. Rates are dramatically higher, and half-empty office towers are worth dramatically less because a huge share of workers simply never return to the office. So the refinancing math no longer works. There isn't enough rental income coming in to cover the new payment. So what does Rosa's bank do? The exact thing every bank does when it doesn't want to admit a loss. It extends the loan and pretends everything's fine. That's actually the real industry nickname for it, extend and pretend. A strategy in precisely the same sense that ignoring your credit card statement is a strategy. Push the deadline out another year or two, keep the loan looking healthy on paper, and hope conditions improve. Each individual decision like that sounds perfectly reasonable. But across the whole system, those losses don't just disappear. They sit there in the dark, quietly stacking up. And a bank sitting on a pile of quiet losses does one predictable thing: it turns cautious. It tells the small business that wanted to expand no, and it tells the young couple hoping for a mortgage no as well. So look at where that leaves you, standing right in the middle. On one side, money from abroad is thinning out, pushing your rate upward. On the other side, credit at home is tightening, making borrowing harder across the board. Two separate pressure points, an ocean apart, both squeezing the exact same person. And that person is you. Now, this is usually the part of the video where some lesser channel tells you to buy gold, dig a bunker, and start bartering canned goods. Instead, let me pause and do the responsible thing. Argue the opposite side as forcefully as I can, because the case against panic is genuinely solid, and you deserve to hear it. The United States is not Greece. This is the single most important fact to grasp, and it's exactly the fact the doom peddlers conveniently leave out. America borrows in its own currency, the dollar, a currency it also happens to print. That's essentially a cheat code. A country that owes money in a currency it fully controls can never be forced into default the way a household, a business, or even Greece can be. It literally cannot run out of the thing it manufactures. When the bill comes due, at the absolute worst, it can simply create the dollars needed to pay it. So a sudden, dramatic, we're out of money default is basically off the table. And if you want proof that heavy debt doesn't automatically spell collapse, just look at Kenji's own country. Japan has carried debt more than double the size of its entire economy for decades, ratios that were supposedly guaranteed to trigger disaster, and Japan is still standing, still functioning, still one of the wealthiest nations on Earth. On top of that, people have been screaming that US debt would end America since the 1980s, and every single one of them has been wrong so far. Betting against the United States has been one of the worst trades in financial history. If you'd sold everything every time someone waved a scary debt chart in your face, you would have missed out on 40 straight years of getting richer. So take a breath and go ahead and close that Goldcoin website tab. But, and you knew a but was coming, here's the trap hiding inside all that reassurance. Every single one of those comforting facts is true, and that's precisely why the collapse won't look like a collapse. Think about what we just laid out. They can't be forced into default. They can always print the dollars needed. So, when the debt genuinely becomes too heavy to carry honestly, that's the exit they take. They don't miss a payment. They pay every single bill on time and in full, using dollars that are quietly worth a little less each year. That's the entire trick. The collapse isn't an explosion, it's an erosion. It's inflation doing exactly the job a default would do, just slowly enough that you end up blaming the grocery store instead of the government. This has a polite academic name for it, financial repression, and it's one of the oldest moves in the book. The name is deliberately dull. Nobody's ever taken to the streets over a phrase like financial repression, which is exactly why they chose it. Historically, it's how nearly every government has handled a mountain of debt it couldn't otherwise pay off. Not through some dramatic reckoning, but by keeping interest rates just a hair below inflation for years on end. The debt slowly shrinks in real terms while your savings slowly erode. The debt does get paid down, it's just paid down out of your bank account in slow motion, without a single vote ever being cast. And there's a second hidden cost lurking behind that first one. Every dollar the government burns on interest is a dollar that can't fund anything else. Roads, defense, the programs your parents are counting on. The interest doesn't just quietly erode your savings, it eats the budget from the inside out, crowding out everything that money was originally meant to do. The debt starts paying for itself, and everyone else gets whatever's left over. You are the repayment plan. You just never got a vote in it. It's the raise you were proud of for about 3 weeks, right up until the grocery receipt quietly absorbed the whole thing. It's the checking account that somehow buys less at year's end than it did at the start, even though the number itself never dropped. That gap, that quiet little gap, is the interest payment on a debt you never personally agreed to. And if this is the first time anyone's actually walked you through how this machine really operates, that gap between what you're told and what's actually happening, that's exactly why I built a community around this topic. It's where we go beyond the headlines and break down precisely how the system moves, and more importantly, what you can actually do to end up on the right side of it instead of quietly funding it. The link's in the description. It's free to join, and it's the most useful space I know of for people who'd rather understand the game than get played by it. Now, because they can't just print money endlessly without setting off runaway inflation, there's a backstop being quietly built for the day the market truly seizes up. When yields spike and nobody wants to buy, the Federal Reserve has quietly become the buyer of last resort, not just for American banks, but for the entire global dollar system. Here's how strange things have gotten. There's now a standing facility where a foreign central bank suddenly needing dollars can hand over its American treasuries to the Federal Reserve like collateral at a pawn shop and walk away with cash. No fire sale necessary. A pawn shop, but for entire nations. Same basic concept as the one down the street, just with better lighting and considerably more zeros. It was originally set up as a temporary measure during the pandemic, meant to last maybe 6 months. It never left. It just quietly became part of the furniture. Tools built as emergency measures for rare moments of crisis have quietly become permanent fixtures. And here's the problem with that. When you use the emergency exit every single day, it stops functioning as an emergency exit. It just becomes the regular hallway. Rare stops meaning rare. The safety net stops being a net and turns into the floor everyone's standing on, and nobody wants to ask what happens if it ever gives way. So let's bring Kenji and Rosa back into the picture because their two stories are really the same story wearing different costumes. Kenji calmly bringing his money home, one unremarkable decision at a time. Rosa quietly extending a loan she already knows is underwater, hoping tomorrow somehow fixes it. Neither one of them is a villain. Neither one is panicking. Neither one thinks they're doing anything historic. They're both simply behaving completely reasonably inside a system that no longer rewards patience. And that's the thing about this particular kind of collapse. It doesn't need a villain. It doesn't need a crash. It just needs a few million reasonable people each making one small, sensible choice, all leaning in the same direction at the same time. And every one of those choices, Kenji's in Tokyo, Rosa's downtown, ends up in the exact same place, the same mortgage payment on the same kitchen table, in a house neither of them will ever lay eyes on. Which is why when people ask me if the debt collapse is coming, I have to correct the tense. It's not a forecast, it's a description. The loyal money is already drifting home. The buyers who replaced it are already jumpy. The interest is already compounding faster than the economy can grow. The emergency tools are already permanent fixtures. And your dollar, right now, is already quietly buying a little less than it did a year ago. None of that is a prediction about some dramatic future event. That's a snapshot of this exact moment. The beginning already happened, you simply never got an announcement, because collapses arriving right on schedule with a public default are the rare kind. This is the common kind, the kind that shows up as a slightly higher mortgage rate on an otherwise quiet Tuesday, asking you to assume it's nothing. So, no, you don't need a bunker, but you do need to stop watching the wrong number. The size of the debt was never going to be the thing that actually got you. It's the slow, quiet transfer, the gap between your raise and your rent, the erosion you were trained to blame on everything except the machine actually causing it. That's the real thing. Now you can see it. And historically, the people who can see the game being played are the ones who don't end up footing the bill for it. Everyone else just gets a slightly higher payment every month for 30 years and never once stops to wonder about a man in Tokyo they'll never meet.